All right, welcome back. Hononegah Algebra 1, 7-6 Day 3 worksheet. 7-6 is one of the harder sections that we do almost the entire year, and it's something that lingers. You will need it again later in this year, and you'll need it again in geometry, and you'll need it again in Algebra 2 and trig. And so this is a section that a lot of people struggle on. So we're going to walk through this one more time, and all the questions I'm going to show you today are going to be done in two different ways. So you don't have to do each question in two different ways. Ultimately, you have to do them in one, but I want to show you that there are two ways, and there's actually more than two ways, but there's two ways that I'm going to show you how to do the 7-6 questions. And there's also a couple 7-5 questions in here. So here we go. I'm going to do question 2 first, even though it's out of order. This is section 7-5. If you have a trinomial, 3 terms, no number in front of the b squared, it's a simple multiplies to be the last, adds to be the middle. So if I have two things that multiply to be negative 32, so again, you have to really know your times tables, but two things that multiply to be negative 32, but they have to add up to be the middle term, which is positive 4. Once you know those two numbers, just drop them in as factors. So b plus 8 and b minus 4. Now, you never want to factor with a number in front. Excuse me, you never want to factor with a negative in front. So if there's ever a negative in front, take the negative away and change the signs. So I now need, and it's changed up now, two things that'll multiply to be 32, but they have to add up to negative 12. So notice that I still have that same 32 that I did on the first one, but my numbers are a little bit different because I want them to multiply to be positive 32 this time, and I want them to add up to be negative 12 this time. So as I factor, I get a minus 8 and a minus 1. And don't forget about the fact that you did take a negative 1 out in the beginning, and that is one of the most common mistakes, is to forget about that negative sign out in front. So again, I'm going to do 4 first and then 3. So I'm going to go back and forth here. So no number in front. It is a trinomial. I need factors of negative 6. So two things that have to multiply to be negative 6, but they have to add up to be positive 1. And so once you have established those two numbers, then it's just a matter of dropping that into the parentheses. So that is factoring with no number in front of the squared term. If there's a negative in front of the squared term, now it's about taking the negative out, changing the signs, finding two numbers that multiply to be 30, that add up to be negative 11, and then don't forget the negative sign when writing your answer. So that's a little bit of 7-5 and then a little bit of 7-6 with the whole negative sign. And now for the big portion. We're really going to dive into 7-6. And again, I'm going to do every question in two different ways. So that is not to say you have to do every question twice. It's merely a question of, all right, there's more than one way to do this question. Which way is best for me? So I'm always going to do things guess and check first, and then I'm going to do everything again by grouping. So notice that you'll see everything done twice. Guess and check. I'm trying to think of two things that'll multiply to be 2v. So whatever the first term is of the trinomial, I want to split that up into two things that multiply to be 2v. And so if it's a prime number like 2, then it's 2v and 1v. So again, two things that'll multiply to be 2v squared. Now comes for probably the hard part. I need two things that'll multiply to be 24. But remember, there's a lot of different possibilities here. 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. So there's options here as I go through this. And I'm going to try 3 and 8. And because the middle is negative, I know it's got to be negative as well. So negative 3 times a negative 8. That's guessing. Like I am literally just trying to guess. With that being said, always check your inner. So if I multiply the inside and if I multiply the outside, and it adds up to the middle term. So doing those two adds up to the middle term, then I guessed correctly. So that is literally called guess and check. Next one. I'm going to do the same question. I'm just going to do it in a totally different way. I'm going to multiply the outside two numbers together. So now I'm going to get 48, positive 48. And I want to figure out two things that'll multiply to be 48, but they got to add up to the middle. So negative 16 times a negative 3 multiply to be 48 and also add up to be negative 19. Now, I am going to rewrite the question. I'm going to start all over. 2v squared, and this becomes a middle term. The 3 becomes a middle term, and then I write the last one again. And now I'm going to do grouping. We did a whole day on factor by grouping. Factor by grouping means I'm going to take the GCF of the first two terms. So I look at just the first two terms and what I can take out. So they're both divisible by 2, and I can take away one v from both. So if I divide by 2 and take away a v, I'm left with v minus 8. And in the next two, I'm going to divide, take a negative 3 out of both. They will always end up being the exact same parenthesis. Group the GCF. So the GCF of the first one and the GCF of the second one get grouped into one, and what's the same is the other. And so you'll notice, and then the second method was much longer, but I got the exact same answer doing two different ways. So as I go through this, I'll probably go through some of this just a little bit faster now, but that is both methods. So the first one, if you say, I'd like to do guess and check, you can tell your teacher that. Or you can say, hey, I'd like to do grouping, and your teacher will understand that as well. We will not judge the method that you choose. We will judge, obviously, whether or not you can get it correct. Guessing. I'm going to multiply the two things that multiply to be 5. And then two things that multiply to be a negative 30. So that becomes a little bit more complicated. So negative 6, positive 5 would be a guess. And you're going to find that I am going to probably guess correctly every time here. So check the inner, check the outer. If these two add up to the middle, which they do, then I guessed correctly. Same question done again. Multiply the outside two numbers together. And this is where grouping can be a little more complicated because you ultimately have quite a big number here. So negative 150. And so when I'm trying to come up with two things that'll multiply to be negative 150, but add up to be 19x, then I need probably a little bit bigger numbers of understanding. Once I have those two, rewrite the question. Take the GCF of the first two, GCF of the second two, group the GCFs, and keep what's the same. Next one. Guess and check. There's only really one way to get 7a, and that would be 7a times 1a. Now, there's a lot of different ways to get 100, though. 1 times 100, 2 times 50, 4 times 25. So again, there's a lot of different ways. So I probably should write all those down. Sorry. 1 times 100, 2 times 50, 4 times 25, 5 times 20. 6 doesn't divide in evenly, sorry. 7, 8, 9, and then 10. Those are all your choices. So what if I tried a negative 10 times a positive 10? That will work. Positive 10a, negative 70a adds up to the middle. Same question. Again, the bigger the numbers are, so I got negative 700, and I'm trying to come up with two numbers that'll be negative 700 that also end up getting you negative 60. And so negative 70 times a positive 10 would be the two numbers I'm looking for. So 7a minus 70a plus 10a minus 100. So rewriting the question, take the GCF of the first two, the GCF of the second two, group the GCFs, and write what's the same. So again, two different methods getting you the same answer. Next one, I'm going to do a little guess and check first. So 5a times 1a. A lot of ways to get 1 times 8 and 2 times 4. And then I got to worry about the fact that it's a positive 8, and I got to worry about the fact that the middle number is a negative 41. So negative 1 times negative 8 would be a possibility. And when I do the inner and the outer, I get the middle. Multiplying the outside two numbers together. Sorry, I didn't write that down correctly. 41a. So I multiply the outside two numbers together, I get 40. Factors of 40, that would get me 41. So negative 40 times negative 1. Rewrite the question. Take the GCF of the first two, GCF of the second two. And so some of you may have to go back to grouping and look at that. If you decide you want to be a person that does all their factoring by grouping, you may have to go back to grouping and make sure you understand that a little bit better. So my board is having some issues here, so I'm trying to make sure the green doesn't pop up anymore. Next one, guess and check. So I need two ways of getting, or a way to get 9. So my choices are really 9 times 1 and 3 times 3. So this is one of those situations where you kind of are, which way do I go on this one? So I'm going to go with 3 and see if that works. And so I may get this one wrong because this one's, again, a little bit more challenging question. And then 60, there's a lot of different ways to get 60. So I'm going to write those down. 1 and 60, 2 and 30, 3 and 20, 4 times 15, 5 times 12, 6 times 10. So again, lots of different ways here that I can try to get 60, and I'm not liking, I'm saying any of those as I'm going through these. So I'm going to go back and guess 9 instead. So what if I did 9x and 1x? And then I'm going to use the 6 and the 10. So let's say I went with a negative 6 and a positive 10. That's an option. And again, I did not guess very well on the first one, but positive 10x, negative 54x does add up to the middle. So that worked out for me. I was able to get the right guessing. I just had to go back a little bit. And again, not a very nice question for grouping either, because I'm going to get negative 540, which isn't exactly something that I know my times tables, but I don't know if I know my times tables well enough to actually get negative 540. And it's actually negative 54 and 10. And on the test, we'll make sure these numbers are relatively nice enough that you won't get extremely big numbers as you're working here. But all right, rewrite the question. Take the GCF of the first two. So again, they're both divisible by 9, and I can take an x away from both. GCF of the second two. And so I group the GCFs and keep what's the same. Next one. A little bit better numbers. Obviously, the numbers are a little smaller here. So when I go to guess, I get 2x and 2x. So that one's not too bad. And when I guess 9, I could guess 9 times 1. And so when I check, and I check, I add up to the middle. So that one isn't quite as bad. The options were a little bit better. 9 doesn't have that many options, and 4 doesn't have that many options. So when I am trying to guess, that one is a little bit more reasonable than some of the last ones I've had. All right, multiply the outside two numbers together. Factors of 18, that would get me 20. So 18 times 2. Rewrite the question. And so when I take the GCF out of the first two, the second two have no numbers, nothing that comes out of everything. So if I don't have any numbers that come out of anything, I can just take a 1 away. And so now that allows me to group the GCF and keep what's the same. So that's a little bit backwards here. You do get the same parentheses, just reversed. So that's not a big deal. Multiplication is commutative, meaning 3 times 5 is the same as 5 times 3. So 2x plus 9 times 2x plus 1 is the same as 2x plus 1 times 2x plus 9. Guess and check. So I need two numbers that'll multiply to be 6r squared. And so I'm going to try 3r and 2r as a possibility. And now I need two things that'll multiply to be 36. But then I also want them to add up to. So I need two things that'll multiply. Sorry about that. It might have been a little interruption there because somebody knocked on the door. Two things that'll multiply to be 36. So let's talk about maybe a negative 9 times a negative 4. Check it. I get negative 8r, negative 27r, and it adds up to the middle. So that is the guess. So I guessed two things that'll multiply to be 6r. I guessed the two things that are multiplied to be 36, and I ended up checking, and it was correct. I feel like this is a very mean worksheet for those people that want to use grouping. I'm multiplying the outside two numbers together, and I'm going to get 216, which is not exactly one that I would probably know off the top of my head. So keeping the numbers big like this also adds a degree of difficulty. But two things that multiply to be 216 that also add up to be negative 37 is a negative 8 times a negative 27. So rewrite the question. Take out the GCF of the first two and the GCF of the second two. So negative 9 is divisible into both. And then group the GCF and keep what's the same. Next one. Factors of 10x squared. So I need two things that'll multiply to be 10x squared. So I'm going to try 5x and 2x. That would be a reasonable guess for those two. And then I want two things that'll multiply to be 6. So I'm going to do 6 times 1. And so when I check the inner and I check the outer, it does add up to the middle. So that is the whole guess and check. That can be confusing. A lot of people would probably want to use 2 and 3 as a guess for 6, and ultimately it doesn't work out. This one is a little bit better for, I would say, the grouping people. So when I multiply the outside two numbers, I'm only looking for 60, and two things that multiply to be 60 and add up to be 17 would be 12 times 5. So then I rewrite the question. Take the GCF of the first two. Nothing comes out as a GCF of the second two. And so I group the GCFs and keep what's the same. Continuing here. Now we're going to get into solving, and it's the same thing. I'm going to factor them. in two different ways, but then I'm only going to solve it once, because once it's in factored form, you just set the factors equal to 0. So I am going to factor this in both ways. Two things that multiply to be 2n squared would be 2n and 1n. So that's really the only way to get 2n squared. I apologize for the small glitch. If there is one, again, I got interrupted. So factors of 2n squared would be 2n and n, and then I need factors of 40. And so again, this is the guess and check. So I'm trying to guess two things that multiply to be 40, and I'm kind of looking at the negative 21 and trying to decide, okay, what would be best? So I'm going to go with a negative 5 times a negative 8. So that is a possibility for 40. Check, negative 5n, negative 16n, and it does add up then to the middle. I'm going to do the same question now using grouping. So I multiply the outside two numbers together, and that ends up being positive 80. And so two things that end up being positive 80 would be a negative 5 times a negative 16. And so rewrite the question. And so I take the GCF of the first two. Now the only thing I can take out of the first two is an n. GCF of the second two, and so I can take out a negative 8. Group what's this? Group the GCF and keep what's the same. So now let's get into the solving part. So both of them I factored. Solve. Anytime I go to solve something that is already in factored form, is I set the parentheses equal to 0. And solve. So I set each of the factors equal to 0. So it doesn't matter which factoring group you did. You set the parentheses, the factors equal to 0, and solve. So keep going here. Guess and check. So 2m and 1m is really the only way to get to. And then 15 is pretty basic as well. So it's got 3 times 5. And so if I check that, it does end up adding up to the middle. Doing the same question now using grouping. So I multiply the outside two numbers together is 30. Factors of 30 that get you 13 would be a 10 and a 3. So rewrite the question. And so I take a 2m out of the first two and a 3 out of the second two. And I group the GCF and keep what's the same. Now for solving. So I set the factors. So in this case, the parentheses, but I set the factors equal to 0 and solve. So m is equal to negative 3/2 and m is equal to negative 5. Guess and check. 3n. So the really 3n squared. So really the only way to get 3n squared is 3n times 1n. Factors of 16 now. And again, I'm keeping your eye on the middle. So I want to be able to get to the middle. So I'm going to do a negative 8 times a positive 2. That would get me negative 16. I check it to make sure that that's right. So when you check, you got to multiply the inner and multiply the outer. And if that adds up to the middle, then you did it correctly. Now I'm going to do the same question in another way. I'm going to multiply the outside two numbers together. I get negative 48. Negative 24 times positive 2. And so 3n squared, rewrite the question. Take the GCF of the first two. Take the GCF of the second two. Group the GCF. And keep what's the same. Now let's get to the solving. So I'm going to set the factors equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 2 and divide by 3. Guess and check. 5k and 1k are factors of 5k squared. And then factors of 10, and remember, always keep your eye on the middle. So negative 2 times negative 5 would be an example that multiplies to be 10. When I check the inner and I check the outer, it adds up to the middle. Doing this the other way now, doing it by grouping. So I'm going to multiply the outside two numbers together is 50. Negative 25 times negative 2 is positive 50. That would add up to the middle. Rewrite the question. Take a 5k out of the first two. Take a negative 2 out of the second two. Group the GCF. And keep what's the same. So again, I did the exact same. I got the exact same answer doing it two different ways. Set the factors equal to 0 and solve. So I get k to equal 2/5, k to equal 5. A couple more examples left. It always has to equal 0. So this is the first time that we haven't had it equaling 0. So the first thing I need to do is rearrange the terms by adding 3, or excuse me, subtracting 3. I don't know why I put add. Subtracting 3 so that it's now on the other side of the question. Factors of 2n squared would be 2n and n. Factors, again, guessing, factors of negative 3 would be negative 3 and 1. Order matters. Like where I put these is going to make a difference because when I do multiply the inner and when I do multiply the outer, it needs to add up to the middle. Doing it in the grouping method now, and I think the grouping one for this one is pretty easy. So I'm going to multiply the outside two numbers together. Factors of negative 6, that would add up to negative 1. Sorry, I didn't write that down correctly. Would be a positive negative 3 and a positive 2. Sorry, I went blank there. Rewrite the question. GCF of the first two is an n. There is no GCF to the second two. And so I end up with an n plus 1 and a 2n minus 3. Once I have it in factored form, to solve it, you merely have to set the parenthesis equal to 0 and solve. Make sure it equals 0 first. Factors of 3r squared would be 3r and r. Factors of negative 40 now, and that's a little bit harder because there's lots of different ways to get 40. 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10. So again, there's some ways that you can get there, 5 and 8. So let's go with 5 and 8. Let's say I had a positive 5 and a negative 8, and I did those backwards. It should be a positive 8. Whoops, sorry, wrong again. Positive 5 and negative 8, I just had them in the wrong place. So here we go, negative 8r, positive 15r. So it's good to guess, and then sometimes, you know what, I guessed wrong, or I put it in the wrong place. So guessing and checking, you do have to actually check. So just because I knew it was 5 and 8, and I had the wrong number in the wrong place, so you have to check every single time. Now, doing this by grouping, I'm going to multiply the outside numbers together. I get negative 120. 120 is not exactly on my radar very well, but it's 15 times negative 8. Rewrite the question. There's a GCF of 3r in the first one, negative 8 in the second one. Solving now. So set the parentheses equal to 0. So r would equal negative 5. And r would equal 8/3. If you have any questions, please make sure you talk to your teacher. This is one of the more challenging sections of the entire year, so please make sure you watch the video if you need to. Maybe re-watch the video, go through each one of these. I'm sorry if I got interrupted there a couple times, but good luck. And if you have any questions, talk to your teacher.